Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Texas. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The setting sun cast long shadows over the Texas plains, painting the weathered wood of the Carter Ranch in hues of orange and crimson. Located 20 miles northwest of Abilene in Taylor County, this once prosperous cattle ranch had, by the fall of 1890, become a stopping point for weary travelers on the newly established stagecoach route connecting Abilene to the smaller settlements in the northwest. The ranch house itself, a substantial two-story structure with a wide front porch and separate cookhouse, stood like a sentinel against the vast expanse of prairie grass. A modest cattle operation, a small dairy, and a bunkhouse completed the property that would eventually become synonymous with one of the most disturbing series of events in West Texas history. Official records from Taylor County indicate that between March 1890 and December 1891, no fewer than 11 travelers who had reportedly stopped at the Carter Ranch were never seen again. What's particularly unsettling is how long it took for anyone to connect these disappearances. The vast, unforgiving landscape of late 19th century Texas made people vanish with alarming regularity, whether through natural causes, accidents, or the lingering violence of the post-Civil War era. The first documentation we have of the Carter family comes from Louisiana state records. Thomas Carter appears in Confederate Army registers as a cavalry officer who served under General Richard Taylor during the Red River Campaign. Military records describe him as methodical, reserved, and possessing uncommon composure under fire. After the war, Thomas returned to his family's modest plantation near Baton Rouge, only to find it in financial ruin, as was common for many Southern landowners. Parish records from St. James Parish show Thomas married Eleanor Devereaux in 1871. Eleanor came from a once prominent New Orleans family whose fortunes had similarly declined after the war. What's notable about Eleanor's background, according to historians who later studied the case, is the curious gap in her documented history between 1865 and 1869. No school records, church attendance, or social mentions exist for those years. When she reappeared in New Orleans society, acquaintances noted she had transformed from a vivacious young woman to one of uncommon seriousness and practicality. Louisiana banking records indicate the Carters struggled financially throughout the 1870s. Thomas attempted several business ventures, a shipping concern, a lumber operation, even a brief partnership in a New Orleans restaurant, all of which failed to provide lasting stability. By 1885, court records show the couple faced significant debt and potential foreclosure on their remaining property. And then, quite suddenly, their fortunes changed. In late 1885, according to notarized documents filed in Baton Rouge, Thomas Carter acquired a substantial sum of money attributed in official paperwork to an inheritance from maternal relations in Virginia. This windfall allowed the Carters to settle their debts, and by 1887, they had liquidated their remaining Louisiana holdings and headed west to Texas. What investigations later revealed, however, is that no such Virginia relations existed. The source of the Carters' sudden wealth remained unexplained throughout subsequent inquiries. More disturbing was the discovery, made only decades later by a persistent researcher examining Louisiana newspaper archives, that 3 travelers staying at a boarding house owned by the Carters outside New Orleans had disappeared without trace in October 1885, precisely when the couple's financial circumstances so dramatically improved. The Carters arrived in Taylor County, Texas in early 1887, purchasing a struggling cattle ranch from Jacob Thornton, who was, according to local newspaper accounts, eager to return east following the unexpected death of his wife. The property, situated at a strategic location where the north-south trail from Buffalo Gap to Anson intersected with the east-west route from Abilene to the Western Territories, had natural advantages for commerce. A reliable spring provided water even during dry seasons, and the gently rolling terrain offered good grazing for cattle. Thomas Carter quickly established himself as a competent, if somewhat aloof, rancher. The Abilene Weekly Reflector described him in an 1888 profile as a gentleman of refined Southern manners, carrying himself with military bearing, yet displaying commendable industry in his new venture. Eleanor Carter received less attention in local accounts, though her dairy operation soon gained reputation for producing exceptional cheese and butter sold at premium prices in Abilene markets. What these early accounts fail to mention, or perhaps deliberately obscured, was the peculiar isolation the Carters maintained from their neighbors. Unlike most frontier settlements, where mutual aid was necessary for survival, the Carters kept interaction to a minimum. According to the 1889 Abilene Register, they employed only 2 permanent ranch hands, brothers Samuel and Jacob Wilson, who lived in the property's bunkhouse. The isolated nature of the ranch, positioned as it was at a crucial juncture between established settlements, made it an ideal resting spot for travelers. And rest they did, though for some that rest became permanent. The Wilson brothers themselves represent a curious chapter in this story. Former cowboys from the Oklahoma Territory, they had reportedly worked on various ranches throughout Texas before settling into permanent employment with the Carters in 1888. Census records and church registries from the territories where they claimed previous employment show no record of their existence prior to their arrival at the Carter Ranch. Later investigations suggested the possibility that Samuel and Jacob Wilson were constructed identities, though this theory remains unproven. By 1889, the Carter Ranch had established a modest reputation among travelers for offering basic overnight accommodation, a bed in a clean loft above the dairy operation, a hot meal and breakfast before departure. The going rate was reportedly 50 cents, considerably less than the $1 or more charged by Abilene's hotels. For budget-conscious travelers or those caught on the trail by approaching darkness or weather, the Carter Ranch represented a practical option. The first documented disappearance connected to the Carter Ranch was that of Allen Morrison, a cattle buyer from Fort Worth. County records show he departed Abilene on March 17, 1890, intending to assess livestock at several ranches northwest of the city. According to statements from the Abilene hotel proprietor where Morrison stayed, the buyer mentioned plans to stop at the Carter place if the hour grows late. Morrison's horse and saddlebags were later discovered abandoned near Buffalo Gap, approximately 15 miles south of Abilene, in the opposite direction from his intended route. His leather portfolio, containing nearly $1,200 in banknotes for cattle purchases, was never recovered. At the time, Morrison's disappearance caused little concern beyond his immediate family. The investigation, such as it was, concluded that he had likely fallen victim to bandits or perhaps even Comanche raiders, though such attacks had become increasingly rare by 1890. Sheriff's Department logs show a cursory investigation lasting only 3 days. What's significant, according to later analysis of the case, is that Morrison had informed colleagues of his intention to stay overnight at the Carter Ranch. This detail wasn't considered relevant until much later. Through the spring and summer of 1890, 4 more individuals would vanish after mentioning plans to stop at the Carter property. James Sullivan, a schoolteacher relocating to Anson, was last seen in Abilene purchasing supplies on April 9, 1890. He told the store clerk he hoped to reach the Carter Ranch by nightfall, where he planned to inquire about room and board while he sought permanent housing in Anson. His trunks, containing books and personal effects, never arrived at the school where he had been hired to teach. Martha Winters, a widow traveling to join her sister's family near Buffalo Gap, departed the stagecoach in Abilene on May 23, 1890. According to the stagecoach manifest and testimony from fellow passengers, Winters had arranged for a local man to transport her to the Carter Ranch, where she would stay overnight before completing her journey the following day. Her sister reported her missing after a week passed without her arrival. Frederick Chapman, a land surveyor working for the Texas and Pacific Railway, informed his employers via telegraph on June 11, 1890, that he had completed his assessment of a proposed spur line and would return to Fort Worth after spending the night at a ranch operated by a former military man northwest of Abilene. Chapman's survey documents and instruments were discovered 3 weeks later in a ravine some 8 miles from the Carter property. The official investigation concluded he had been thrown from his horse and dragged, though the horse itself was never found. Elijah Powell, a traveling photographer known for his landscape portraits of West Texas, mentioned to associates in Abilene that he planned to capture the sunset from the elevated ridge behind the Carter property on August 3, 1890. In his last known communication, a letter posted to his brother in Dallas, Powell wrote, "The light here has a quality I've not seen elsewhere, a clarity that reveals the essence of whatever it touches. I've arranged lodging at a ranch operated by a most interesting couple." The husband speaks with the precision of an educated man, while his wife watches everything with eyes that miss nothing. Powell's photographic equipment, valued at over $300, was reported missing along with him. None of his photographs from the Carter Ranch ever surfaced, though a local Abilene merchant recalled Eleanor Carter selling a fine brass-fitted camera box in September 1890, claiming it had been abandoned by a traveler who departed suddenly. In each case, investigations remained cursory, disconnected, and ultimately inconclusive. The vast territories of West Texas, still sparsely populated and inadequately policed, made thorough investigation of missing persons nearly impossible. Without evidence of foul play occurring within their jurisdiction, authorities were quick to attribute disappearances to the natural hazards of frontier travel: exposure, accident, animal attack, or the occasionally violent encounters between strangers on isolated trails. It wasn't until September 1890 that Sheriff Robert Thornton of Taylor County began to suspect a pattern. According to his personal journal, recovered decades later from the county archives, Thornton wrote, "I find it peculiar that the Carter property figures so prominently in the last known movements of our missing persons. While I hesitate to cast suspicion without evidence, I believe further inquiry is warranted. The Carters maintain an air of respectability, yet something in Mrs. Carter's manner unsettles me. She watches rather than observes, measures rather than sees." Sheriff Thornton's journal entries from this period reveal a methodical man increasingly troubled by his suspicions, yet constrained by the limitations of frontier law enforcement. On September 27th, he wrote, "Tomorrow I shall ride to the Carter place under the pretense of investigating reports of cattle rustling in the area. I mean to observe the layout of the property and the demeanor of its occupants more carefully than circumstances have previously allowed." That inquiry never materialized in any substantive form. According to municipal records, on September 28, 1890, Sheriff Thornton suffered a severe fall from his horse while returning from a visit to the Carter Ranch. He survived, but sustained a serious head injury that affected his memory and cognitive functions. Upon his return to duty 6 weeks later, he showed no further interest in investigating the disappearances. When questioned about this sudden change by his deputy, Wallace Simmons, Thornton reportedly stated, "There's nothing untoward at the Carter place." Fine Christian people doing the Lord's work in difficult country. Deputy Simmons, in a sworn statement provided in 1891 after the case broke, described Thornton's behavior following his injury as markedly altered. According to Simmons, the sheriff who returned to duty was not the same man who had ridden out to the Carter Ranch. Something fundamental had changed in his manner and his thinking. When I attempted to discuss the missing travelers, he became agitated and insisted the matter was closed. The winter of 1890-91 brought record cold to West Texas. The Carter Ranch, with its sturdy construction and well-stocked supplies, continued to serve as a waypoint for travelers. During these months, local newspapers reported 3 more disappearances: 2 salesmen and a doctor returning from a house call in the rural territories. All 3 had mentioned to associates their intention to seek accommodation at the Carter Ranch should they be caught by darkness or inclement weather. Dr. William Evers, A physician from Abilene vanished in November 1890 after treating a family for influenza in a settlement 10 miles north of the Carter property. His medical bag was discovered the following spring in a dry creek bed, the instruments still inside, but his supply of morphine and other medications missing. The two salesmen, Howard Phillips and George Montgomery, traveling together representing a St. Louis dry goods supplier, were last seen purchasing feed for their horses at a stable in Abilene. On December 17, 1890, the stable operator later testified that the men had specifically inquired about the distance to the Carter Ranch, as they had heard it offered reasonable accommodation. What's particularly notable about the Carter operation was their self-sufficiency. Unlike most ranches of the era, they rarely purchased supplies from Abilene merchants, making only quarterly trips for absolute necessities. According to ledgers from Johnson's General Store, these purchases were modest, primarily coffee, sugar, salt, ammunition, and fabrics. Eleanor Carter's dairy operation produced cheese, butter, and occasionally beef that they would sell in town, but they never acquired fresh meat themselves. When questioned about this later, Thomas Carter explained they hunted their own game and maintained a smokehouse. This self-sufficiency extended to medical needs as well. Unlike many frontier households that regularly purchased patent medicines and remedies, the Carters never appeared in the transaction records of Abilene's two pharmacies. This detail became significant only in retrospect, when investigators discovered an extensive collection of medical texts in the remains of the ranch house, along with a cabinet containing surgical instruments of professional quality, far beyond what would be expected for normal ranch operations. The absence of regular trade might have continued indefinitely had it not been for the drought of spring 1891, which forced the Carters to seek additional water supplies for their dairy herd. Thomas Carter contracted with Marcus Finley, a well digger from Abilene, to excavate a new well on the northwest corner of the property, where preliminary surveys suggested an accessible aquifer. Finley arrived at the Carter Ranch on April 12, 1891, with his equipment and two assistants, brothers John and Matthew Spencer, experienced laborers who had worked with Finley on numerous prior projects. According to a sworn statement he would later provide to authorities, what happened next altered the course of his life forever. Having established their work site, Finley sent John Spencer to the main house to confirm the exact location for the well. When Spencer didn't return after 30 minutes, Finley sent Matthew to find his brother. Another half hour passed with no sign of either man. Concerned, but not yet alarmed, Finley approached the main house himself. As he neared the back entrance, he noted the unusual silence. No sounds of conversation, no kitchen noises, nothing to indicate human presence despite the 3 horses tethered nearby indicating the Carters were home. He knocked at the kitchen door. No response. He called out. Silence. It was then, according to his statement, that he noticed the unusual odor emanating from the root cellar doors adjacent to the kitchen entrance. A thick, sickly sweet smell, he would later testify, like meat gone bad, but with an underlying sharpness that burned the nose. Against his better judgment, Finley opened the cellar doors and descended the stairs, calling for his men. What he discovered in that cellar was only partially documented in official records. The original witness statement filed with the Taylor County Sheriff's Department was reportedly misplaced during a courthouse reorganization in Pius, 1909. What remains are fragments from newspaper accounts and courthouse clerk notes, describing evidence of systematic butchery and storage methods consistent with meat preservation. In a private letter to his brother in Dallas, discovered only in 1932 after his death, Finley provided a more detailed account of what he witnessed. The cellar had been converted into something between a slaughterhouse and a medical theater. Tables of heavy oak, scored and stained, stood in the center of the room. Along the walls were shelves holding glass jars of various sizes, their contents preserved in cloudy liquid. Equipment for processing meat hung from ceiling hooks, saws, cleavers, specialized knives. And in one corner, a desk with a ledger open to a page of careful notations, weights, dates, and what appeared to be assessments of quality. Most disturbing was Finley's description of what he found in an adjoining chamber, a room containing 3 iron bed frames, each with leather restraints attached to the corners. The floor beneath sloped subtly toward a central drain. On a small table lay my men's pocket watches and Matthew's prized silver belt buckle. Of the men themselves I saw no trace, yet I knew with terrible certainty they would never leave that place alive. Finley fled the property immediately, riding the 20 miles to Abilene at a pace that nearly killed his horse. He arrived shortly before sundown, his clothes soiled and his manner described by witnesses as that of a man who has looked upon things no man should see. He demanded an immediate audience with the new sheriff, William Holcomb, to whom he related his disturbing findings. Sheriff Holcomb organized a posse of 8 men who rode out to the Carter Ranch at first light on April 13, 1891. Upon arrival, they found the property deserted. Thomas and Eleanor Carter, along with the Wilson brothers, had vanished, taking with them only what could be carried on horseback. The ranch house had been partially burned, though the fire had extinguished itself before consuming the entire structure. The investigation that followed revealed evidence suggesting a much more extensive operation than initially suspected. The cellar, partially damaged by the fire, nonetheless contained numerous personal effects identified as belonging to missing travelers: pocket watches, jewelry, wallets, and distinctive clothing items. More disturbing were the modifications to the structure itself. Soundproofed rooms in the basement level, reinforced doors with external locks, and a drainage system leading from the cellar to a distant part of the property. Among the items recovered from the cellar was a medical case identified as belonging to Dr. William Evers, containing several surgical instruments arranged with precise care. A locked drawer in Thomas Carter's study yielded a collection of small personal items: wedding rings, lockets containing hair or photographs, engraved watches, apparently kept as souvenirs. Most telling was a hidden compartment beneath the bedroom floorboards containing over $3,000 in cash and negotiable securities, a fortune by 1891 standards. The dairy operation, it seemed, was genuine, but it served as only one facet of the Carter enterprise. Analysis of financial records recovered from a lockbox showed that while the cattle ranch operated at a consistent loss, the family maintained substantial deposits at banks in both Abilene and, curiously, New Orleans. The source of this wealth remained unexplained by conventional ranching activities. Most significant was the discovery made when authorities began excavating the ground behind the smokehouse. Over the course of 3 days, they unearthed human remains representing at least 17 individuals. The condition of these remains suggested they had been processed in a manner consistent with animal butchery, with certain portions systematically removed. According to the examiner's report, most bodies showed evidence of careful dissection rather than violent dismemberment, with major organs and substantial portions of muscle tissue absent. Further excavation throughout the property eventually uncovered additional remains in a ravine approximately half a mile from the main house, bringing the estimated victim count to between 23 and 28 individuals. The precise number proved impossible to determine due to the fragmentary nature of the remains and the destruction of evidence caused by the partial fire and subsequent exposure. The Wilson brothers were apprehended 2 weeks later in El Paso, attempting to cross into Mexico. Under interrogation, Jacob Wilson provided a partial confession, indicating that the operation had been ongoing since shortly after the Carters established the ranch. According to Wilson's statement, travelers were selected based on specific criteria. They needed to be individuals without strong local connections, preferably those who had mentioned to others they were heading west or north, creating an expectation they wouldn't return eastward. Wilson's testimony, preserved in court documents, described a methodical operation. Mr. Carter had a way of sizing up folks, seeing which ones wouldn't be missed. He preferred them healthy and well-fed. He'd invite them to dinner where Mrs. Carter would serve her special tea. Once they grew dizzy, he'd suggest they rest. By morning, they'd be processed like any other livestock. When questioned about his role in the operation, Wilson displayed an unsettling detachment. I was paid to do a job. On a ranch, you slaughter cattle. At the Carter place, the livestock just walked in on 2 legs instead of 4. Meat is meat when you get down to it. Samuel Wilson, unlike his brother, maintained complete silence throughout interrogation and subsequent incarceration. The only statement attributed to him came from a prison guard who overheard him muttering in his cell the night before his death from tuberculosis in 1894. She's still out there, still hungry, still watching. The Carters themselves were never found. Unconfirmed reports place them in various locations throughout the subsequent decades. New Orleans, Mexico City, even London, but no verified sighting was ever established. A trunk recovered from a New Orleans boarding house in 1896 contained papers suggesting Eleanor Carter had family connections to the infamous Bender family of Kansas, who had perpetrated similar crimes in the 1870s, though this connection was never definitively established. Among the documents recovered from this trunk was a journal written in a precise feminine hand, presumably Eleanor's, that shed disturbing light on her perspective. The cattle business is wasteful, so much lost, so much discarded. Human stock is far more efficient. The yield is higher, the quality superior, and the market unaware of what it consumes. There is a certain elegance to it that Thomas, for all his methodical ways, fails to appreciate. He sees necessity. I see transformation. The most disturbing aspect of the case emerged slowly through examination of town records and merchant accounts. During their years of operation, the Carters had regularly traveled to Abilene to sell their dairy products, cheese, butter, and occasionally what they marketed as smoked beef and potted meat for the town's hotel restaurant and saloons. The implications of this commerce cast a shadow over the town that lingered long after the events themselves. Ledgers from the Abilene Hotel show regular purchases of Carter preserved meats between 1889 and 1891. The hotel restaurant was particularly noted for its exceptional potted beef served to travelers and local businessmen. Similar entries appear in the account books of the Texas Saloon and the Railway Cafe, both establishments catering to the transient population moving through Abilene during this period. When these connections came to light, the reaction was predictable. Denial, followed by disgust, followed by deliberate forgetting. Newspaper accounts from May 1891 show the Abilene City Council passed an emergency ordinance requiring all food items in public establishments to be destroyed and replaced. The town underwent what one observer called a collective purging, both literal and figurative. Yet questions remained that no one seemed eager to answer. How much had the town unwittingly consumed? Who had partaken of the Carters' special offerings? And perhaps most troubling, had anyone suspected the truth before Finley's discovery forced it into the open? In 1892, all structures on the Carter property were razed by order of the county commissioner. The land remained vacant until 1905, when it was purchased by a cattle company that maintained it as grazing land only, without rebuilding on the original homestead site. Local lore holds that nothing grows properly on the exact location where the house once stood, though geological surveys suggest this is due to mineral deposits affecting soil quality rather than any supernatural cause. The case of the Carter Ranch faded from public consciousness relatively quickly. The national press, focused on labor unrest in eastern cities and the closing of the frontier, gave it only passing attention. Local newspapers, concerned about Abilene's reputation as the town sought railroad investment, gradually reduced their coverage. By June 1891, mentions of the case had been relegated to back pages. By August, they had disappeared entirely from local publications. This deliberate forgetting extended to official records. Court documents related to the Wilson brothers' trial were sealed by judicial order. Medical reports on the recovered remains were classified as confidential and eventually lost during an office relocation. Even the deed records for the property were modified to eliminate any mention of the Carter name, referring instead to the former Thornton property in subsequent transactions. By 1893, the matter was rarely mentioned in public discourse. The Wilson brothers died in prison. Samuel from tuberculosis in 1894, Jacob by suicide in 1897, leaving a brief note that read simply, "I hear them in the walls, waiting, watching." The missing travelers became statistics rather than individuals with stories and connections. The land itself, vast and indifferent, absorbed the history of what had transpired there. Yet traces remained, preserved in fragmented records and oral histories. In 1923, historian Margaret Wheeler attempted to compile a comprehensive account of the Carter case for her doctoral dissertation at the University of Texas. According to university archives, Wheeler abandoned the project after 6 months of research, citing disturbing inconsistencies in official records and reluctance of witnesses to speak openly. Her notes, which might have provided valuable insights, were reportedly destroyed in a house fire in 1925, a fire that Wheeler herself barely escaped. In a letter to her academic advisor dated 2 weeks before the fire, Wheeler wrote, "The deeper I dig into this case, the more convinced I become that what we think we know is merely the surface of something far more extensive." The Carter operation didn't begin in Texas. I found evidence suggesting similar disappearances around properties connected to them in Louisiana, and possibly even earlier in Mississippi. More disturbing are the indications that they didn't act alone, that perhaps they were part of something larger, something organized. Wheeler never resumed her academic career after the fire. County records show she purchased a small property in the Davis Mountains of West Texas, where she lived in seclusion until her death in 1948. The only visitor recorded during those years was a journalist from the El Paso Tribune who interviewed her in 1937 for a feature on regional history. In his unpublished notes, he recorded Wheeler's parting words, "Some stories resist telling, some truths resist knowing. There are corners of our history better left unexplored." In 1947, construction workers expanding Highway 83 northwest of Abilene uncovered additional human remains approximately 3 miles from the former Carter property. Analysis suggested these remains dated from the same period as the Carter case, though no definitive connection was ever established. What was notable about this discovery, according to the foreman's report, was the unusual arrangement of the bones, placed in a precise pattern that one worker, a former medical student, identified as consistent with anatomical teaching displays. The investigation was cursory, and the remains were reburied with minimal documentation. Perhaps most intriguing is the journal recovered from a San Antonio boarding house in 1952, allegedly written by Thomas Carter himself. The document, comprising over 100 pages of increasingly erratic handwriting, details not only the mechanics of the Carter operation, but its underlying philosophy. If authentic, it reveals a mind of disturbing clarity about its own monstrous actions. "We waste nothing," one passage reads. "The cattle take from the land, and we take from the cattle. The travelers take from the road, and we take from the travelers. All is consumed, all is transformed. Those who pass through our hands become part of something larger than themselves. They nourish the town that never knew them. They sustain strangers who never suspected the communion they shared." Another entry offers cold insight into the selection process. "Eleanor has an instinct for quality that surpasses my own. She can assess a specimen with a glance, the density of muscle, the cleanliness of the flesh, the likely yield. She prefers those with education and refinement, claiming they produce a superior flavor. I suspect her preference has more to do with pleasure in reducing such individuals to mere substance. Most disturbing are the passages suggesting the Carters viewed their actions as something approaching a religious vocation. We are transformers of essence. Through us the wandering become the sustaining. The lost become the found, absorbed into the community that would otherwise exclude them. Is this not a form of grace? To take the solitary traveler and make him part of 100 others who would never have welcomed him in life? Authenticity of this journal remains disputed. It disappeared from police evidence storage in 1953 and has never been recovered. The single researcher granted access to it before its disappearance, Dr. Howard Phillips of Baylor University, refused to discuss its contents, and shortly thereafter abandoned academia entirely. He died in 1967, having never published his findings. A former colleague of Phillips, speaking anonymously to a reporter in 1968, claimed that Phillips had been profoundly affected by his examination of the journal. Howard was never the same after reading that document. He'd been a rational man, methodical in his thinking. Afterward, he became obsessed with food purity, eventually refusing to eat anything he hadn't grown or raised himself. He spoke of contamination, not in a bacterial sense, but as if some moral taint could be transmitted through consumption. What remains of the Carter case today are questions rather than answers. How many travelers actually fell victim to the ranch's deadly hospitality? Records suggest a minimum of 17, based on recovered remains, but estimates range as high as 30. How did Thomas Carter, a documented war veteran with an established identity, create his operation without raising suspicion? And perhaps most disturbing, were the Carters unique or merely the ones who happened to be discovered? The landscape of 1890s Texas, with its vast distances and transient population, created perfect conditions for predators. For every documented case like the Carters, how many others operated undetected, their victims attributed to the natural dangers of frontier life? The historical record offers uncomfortable possibilities rather than reassuring certainties. In 1968, the last surviving resident of Abilene who had lived through the Carter incident was interviewed for a local historical society project. Martha Jenkins, then 93 years old, had been a young girl working at Johnson's General Store when the case broke. Her recollection offers a fitting epitaph for the whole disturbing affair. "What I remember most wasn't the horror of what they'd done, though that was terrible enough," she said. "It was how ordinary they seemed. Mrs. Carter would come into the store with her cheese and butter, smiling and asking after everyone's health. Mr. Carter would tip his hat to ladies on the street. They were monsters hiding in plain sight, and not one of us saw them for what they were until it was too late. That's what haunts me still, not what happened at that ranch, but how blind we all were to it happening right under our noses." Jenkins recalled one particular interaction that had gained significance only in retrospect. Mrs. Carter came into the store one afternoon in the winter of 1890. She was selecting spices, salt, pepper, unusual blends I didn't recognize. She told me they were for her special preserves. "Everyone has their secret ingredient," she said. "But the true secret is in knowing your source." She smiled when she said it. And I remember thinking how odd her teeth looked, perfect and white, like she'd never had a day of poor health in her life. The Carter Ranch case remains a disturbing chapter in Texas history, not because it presents some unique aberration, but because it suggests the thin veneer separating civilization from barbarism. In the vast empty spaces of the American frontier, some travelers simply disappeared, becoming not just victims of human predators, but unwilling participants in a cycle of consumption that transformed them from individuals into sustenance. Decades after the case, fragments of information continued to surface, suggesting dimensions to the story that had never been fully explored. In 1957, a retired Texas Ranger named James Buchanan published his memoirs, which included a brief but provocative chapter on the Carter case. Buchanan, who had been part of the manhunt for the Carters after their disappearance, wrote, "We tracked them as far as Laredo, where their trail vanished. But what troubled me more than their escape was what we found in Thomas Carter's study, correspondence suggesting connections to similar operations elsewhere. Letters from New Orleans, St. Louis, even Chicago, written in a code we could only partially decipher. References to shipments, processing methods, and market expansion. I've always wondered if the Carters were part of something larger, not just killers, but suppliers." Buchanan's allegations were dismissed by official channels as sensationalism designed to sell books. Yet, private correspondence between the Texas Attorney General's office and federal authorities in 1958, declassified only in the 1980s, shows that an investigation was quietly opened based on Buchanan's claims. This investigation was abruptly closed 6 months later without explanation or findings. In 1962, anthropologist Carolyn Mitchell conducted a series of interviews with elderly residents of Abilene for an oral history project. One interview with former butcher's apprentice Walter Simmons contained a disturbing recollection. Carter would come to town with what he called specialty meats, already processed, ready for cooking. The hotel and restaurants paid premium prices. I remember my boss examining it once, commenting on the unusual quality. "Never seen marbling quite like this," he said. After the Carter business came to light, my boss burned his butcher shop to the ground. Rebuilt everything from scratch, even bought new tools. Never spoke of it, but I knew why. The land where the Carter Ranch once stood is now private property, used for oil extraction since the 1950s. Nothing remains of the original structures. No marker commemorates the events that transpired there. The story lives on only in fragmented records, disputed accounts, and the persistent discomfort it creates. The suggestion that sometimes those who disappear don't just vanish. Sometimes, in the most literal and disturbing sense, they are consumed by the very communities that fail to notice their absence. In 1968, during preliminary excavation for an oil well on the former Carter property, workers uncovered a sealed metal container buried approximately 6 feet below the surface. Inside was a collection of personal documents, apparently placed there shortly before the Carters fled in 1891. Among these was a leather-bound ledger containing what appeared to be recipes, written in Eleanor Carter's precise handwriting. These recipes, with clinical detachment, detailed methods for preparing various cuts and portions of what the ledger referred to only as special stock. The oil company executive who discovered these documents reportedly ordered them destroyed immediately. According to his secretary, who later spoke to a local historian, the executive read only a few pages before closing the ledger. "I've never seen a man's complexion change so quickly," she recalled. "He looked physically ill. He had the documents burned that same day and ordered the excavation moved to another location on the property." As you drive west from Abilene today, the landscape still holds the same vast emptiness it presented to travelers in 1890. The horizon stretches endlessly, punctuated by oil derricks instead of windmills, but no less isolating for all our modern connectivity. Somewhere out there, unmarked and unremarkable, is the ground where the Carter Ranch once stood. The wind passes over it just as it passes over any other patch of Texas soil, carrying no memory of what that ground once absorbed. And sometimes, in certain small-town restaurants along the old routes, when the special is described as an old family recipe, one might pause to wonder just how old, and whose family, and what recipes were passed down through generations best forgotten. For some secrets, like the final fate of Thomas and Eleanor Carter, the Texas landscape keeps its counsel, vast and silent under an endless sky. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Carter case is not what we know, but what remains unknown. The true extent of their activities, the full count of their victims, and whether they truly acted alone, these questions persist despite extensive investigation. What transformed a Southern gentleman and his well-bred wife into methodical killers? Was it merely economic necessity, as some historians suggest, or something more fundamentally disturbed in their nature? The few photographs that survive of Thomas and Eleanor Carter show a handsome, well-dressed couple of dignified bearing. In an 1888 photograph taken at an Abilene livestock auction, Thomas stands straight-backed in a dark suit, his beard neatly trimmed, eyes gazing directly at the camera with untroubled confidence. Eleanor, seated beside him, wears a high-necked dress appropriate to the period, her hair arranged in the fashionable style of the day. Nothing in their appearance suggests the darkness that would later be associated with their name. A closer examination of that photograph, undertaken by criminologist Dr. Lawrence Meyer in 1954, yielded what he considered significant observations. Note the unusual stillness in Eleanor Carter's posture. While photographic subjects of this era typically show slight blurring due to movement during long exposure times, she displays perfect composure. More telling is her gaze, not at the camera, but at a point just outside the frame, where market-goers would have been gathering. It is the look of a predator assessing potential prey. In 1964, a collection of letters was discovered during renovation of an old Abilene post office, apparently fallen behind a sorting cabinet and forgotten for decades. Among these was correspondence from Eleanor Carter to a woman identified only as Cousin Margaret in New Orleans, dated January 1890. While most of the content concerned mundane matters, weather, local gossip, complaints about frontier living, one passage stands out. Thomas has refined his technique considerably since our early experiments in Louisiana. The yield is much improved, and the preparation methods ensure nothing is wasted. We have developed quite a reputation for our special preserves, though if the good people of Abilene knew the secret ingredient, I dare say they would be simultaneously horrified and fascinated. How strange that what they would reject knowing, they consume with such appreciation when ignorant. The letter was submitted to handwriting analysis and confirmed to match known samples of Eleanor Carter's writing from property deeds and bank documents. The identity of Cousin Margaret was never established, despite efforts to trace connections through New Orleans records. Another disturbing document emerged in 1965 when the grandson of Sheriff William Holcomb discovered a sealed envelope while sorting through his grandfather's effects. The envelope, marked "To be destroyed unopened upon my death," contained a single page written in Holcomb's hand, dated June 17, 1891. The brief statement read, "What we found at the Carter property exceeds what has been publicly disclosed." The scope and organization suggest something beyond the capacity of two individuals, regardless of their depravity. I believe others were involved who remain at large. I have communicated this concern to federal authorities, who have advised discretion pending their investigation. May God forgive me if my silence enables further harm. No record of any federal investigation exists in Justice Department archives from this period. If such an inquiry occurred, its findings were either lost or deliberately obscured. This gap in the historical record has fueled speculation about possible cover-ups or institutional involvement, though most serious historians dismiss such theories as unsupported by credible evidence. The fate of Thomas and Eleanor Carter, after their flight from Texas, remains perhaps the most tantalizing mystery of the case. Sporadic reports of sightings emerged for decades following their disappearance, though none were ever verified. A New Orleans police report from 1893 mentions questioning a couple matching the Carter's description in connection with a missing person case, though no arrests were made. A hotel register from San Francisco in 1894 contains the signatures Thomas and Eleanor Smith, written in a hand bearing striking similarity to Thomas Carter's known handwriting. Most intriguing is an account from British customs, records indicating that a couple identified as Thomas and Eleanor Cartwright arrived in Liverpool in January 1895 aboard a vessel from New York. Their stated occupation was listed as importers of specialty foods, and their intended address was a fashionable district in London. Attempts to trace this couple through subsequent British records have yielded no conclusive results. The last credible report comes from Mexico City, where municipal records show a Tomas and Eleanor Carter purchasing property in 1897. The couple operated a small but exclusive restaurant catering primarily to American and European expatriates until 1901, when they sold the property and vanished once again. Local newspapers from 1901 contain a brief mention of an unfortunate incident at the restaurant involving a missing American businessman, though details are scarce and no formal investigation appears to have occurred. Whether any of these reports actually pertain to the Carters remains uncertain. Given their demonstrated capacity for adopting new identities and blending into communities, it seems plausible they could have established themselves elsewhere under assumed names. The substantial funds they took with them would have facilitated such a transition, allowing them to purchase legitimacy in a new location. Further complicating the historical record is the fire that destroyed much of the Abilene courthouse in 1902. While many records had been duplicated and stored elsewhere, some materials related to the Carter case were lost permanently, including detailed inventories of items recovered from the property and several witness statements. This loss of primary documentation has hampered subsequent research efforts and allowed speculative accounts to sometimes replace verifiable facts. One persistent rumor, never substantiated by credible evidence, suggests that the Carters did not escape at all. According to this account, first recorded in a 1937 collection of Texas folklore, the posse that arrived at the Carter Ranch actually found the couple, but executed them without trial, burying the bodies in unmarked graves. Supposedly, this vigilante justice was then concealed through a fabricated story of the Carters' escape, with the complicity of local authorities concerned about the case's impact on regional development and investment. This theory finds little support among serious historians who point to the documented manhunt that followed the discovery of the Carter crimes. Sheriff's Department expenditure records show significant resources allocated to the search, including the hiring of trackers and payment for telegraphed alerts to law enforcement agencies throughout the Southwest and into Mexico. Such efforts would have been unnecessary had the Carters already been eliminated. More credible, though still speculative, is the theory that the Carters had established contingency plans long before their crimes were discovered. Bankers' records from 1889 show Thomas Carter opening accounts in 3 different banks under slightly varied names: Thomas Carter, T.C. Carter, and Thomas C. Smith, with modest but regular deposits made to each. This financial preparation, combined with their minimal social connections in Abilene, suggests a readiness to abandon their identity when necessary. A curious footnote to the Carter story emerged in 1919 when a safety deposit box in a New Orleans bank was opened after remaining unclaimed for the statutory period of time. According to bank records, the box had been rented in 1891 by an E.D. Carter, initials matching Eleanor Devereaux Carter. The contents included several $1,000s in gold coins, jewelry later identified as belonging to Martha Winters and Elijah Powell, and a small leather-bound diary. The diary itself disappeared from police evidence within a week, and no official record of its contents was ever filed. An anonymous letter sent to the New Orleans Picayune in 1920 claimed to quote passages from this diary, describing the Carters' journey from Texas through the Indian Territory to St. Louis and eventually back to New Orleans. According to this account, they lived in the French Quarter under assumed names for nearly a year before departing for Europe in late 1892. The letter's author claimed to be a police officer who had read the diary before its disappearance, though this claim cannot be verified. In 1943, during construction of a military facility near Alexandria, Louisiana, workers uncovered human remains on property that records showed had been owned briefly by Thomas Carter's father in the 1860s. Examination suggested the remains predated the Carter Ranch case by several decades, though the methods of dismemberment showed disturbing similarities to those employed in Texas. This discovery raised the possibility that the Carter family's involvement in such activities might have spanned generations, though conclusive evidence for this theory remains elusive. The psychological profile of the Carters has been the subject of extensive speculation among criminologists and psychiatrists. In a 1955 analysis published in the Journal of Criminal Psychology, Dr. Martin Lowenstein characterized Thomas Carter as a methodical psychopath whose military experience provided both the discipline and detachment necessary for systematic predation. Eleanor Carter he described as potentially the more disturbed of the pair, a consummate actress whose external refinement masked profound disturbance. Lowenstein's assessment, while influential, was necessarily constrained by the limited information available and the absence of any direct observation or testimony from the Carters themselves. More recent analyses have suggested different interpretations, including the possibility that economic desperation, rather than inherent psychopathology, initially motivated their crimes, with moral boundaries eroding gradually through rationalization and compartmentalization. Dr. Elizabeth Harmon, writing in the American Journal of Forensic Psychiatry in 1967, observed the Carter case demonstrates the potential for seemingly ordinary individuals to transition into predatory behavior, given sufficient isolation, rationalization, and gradual normalization of deviance. What begins as an aberration becomes, through repetition and reward, a standard mode of operation justified through elaborate internal logic. In the decades following the Carter case, reports of similar crimes occasionally surfaced in other isolated rural locations. A family in Minnesota in 1907, a couple operating a hunting lodge in Montana in 1923, a roadside inn in West Virginia in 1949. All featured patterns reminiscent of the Carter operation, though none approached its scale or sophistication. Whether these represented independent occurrences or suggested some form of inspiration or connection remains unclear. What makes the Carter case particularly disturbing is not merely the nature of their crimes, but the community's unwitting participation in them. The restaurants and hotels of Abilene, serving what they believed to be conventional meat products, became unwitting accomplices in a cycle of consumption that transformed murder victims into commercial goods. This aspect of the case, the involuntary cannibalism inflicted upon an unsuspecting public, accounts in large part for the collective amnesia that followed the revelations. The town's response to the discovery was swift and comprehensive. According to Abilene Health Department records, a mandatory inspection of all food service establishments was ordered on April 20, 1891. All meat products of uncertain provenance were destroyed, and merchants were required to provide documented evidence of their supply sources. The economic impact was substantial, with several businesses closing permanently in the aftermath. More significant was the psychological impact, documented in a series of letters collected by Reverend Arthur Simmons of the First Methodist Church. These letters, written by parishioners seeking spiritual guidance, express profound distress at the possibility of having consumed human flesh. One correspondent wrote, "I am haunted by the question of my unwitting participations in this abomination. Have I, through no intention of my own, become party to an act I would consider unthinkable? And if so, what stain does this leave upon my soul?" Reverend Simmons's responses, preserved in his personal papers, reflect a pastor struggling to provide comfort in circumstances beyond conventional theology. "God judges the heart and intent, not the unwitting action," he wrote to one troubled member. "You remain pure in His sight, though I understand the feeling of contamination that troubles you." Perhaps we might consider this a reminder of how easily we may be led into participation with evil when we fail to question the sources of what sustains us. By 1892, public discussion of the case had largely ceased in Abilene. Newspaper archives show a deliberate shift toward emphasizing positive developments: railroad expansion, new businesses, cultural events. The Carter case, when referenced at all, was described in increasingly vague terms as the unfortunate incident or the troubling affair northwest of town. This collective suppression extended beyond public discourse into individual memory. Interviews conducted in the 1930s with elderly residents who had lived through the period revealed a consistent pattern of avoidance and minimization. Many claimed limited recollection of details they had surely known. Others recounted the case as if it had occurred in a distant location rather than their own community. This psychological distancing mechanism, while understandable, contributed to the fragmentation of the historical record. The physical erasure of the Carter presence was equally thorough. Following the demolition of the ranch structures in 1892, the property remained unoccupied for over a decade. Maps from this period show the location marked simply as vacant land, rather than by reference to its former owners. When the property was eventually developed for cattle grazing in 1905, newspaper accounts referred to the expansion of the Southwestern Cattle Company onto previously unutilized terrain. What? remains today of the Carter Ranch case exists primarily in scattered historical documents, oral traditions of increasingly dubious reliability, and the morbid fascination the story continues to evoke. The actual location of the ranch, approximately 7 miles northwest of present-day Interstate 20, bears no marker or memorial. Oil pumps operate on the site, extracting another form of value from land once soaked with blood. For most of the 20th century, the case existed as a whispered legend rather than a documented historical event. School textbooks on Texas history omitted any mention of it, focusing instead on the heroic narratives of frontier development. Local historical societies maintained selective archives that emphasized community achievement while excluding darker chapters. Even academic institutions approached the topic with notable caution, perhaps concerned about the implications of exploring such disturbing material without clear scholarly purpose. This changed somewhat in the 1970s, when true crime literature became increasingly mainstream and the Carter case attracted renewed attention. Several popular accounts appeared, though these often emphasized sensational aspects while neglecting rigorous historical methodology. The 1974 book Butchers of the Plains by Raymond Chandler, no relation to the mystery writer, sold over 100,000 copies despite containing numerous factual errors and unsubstantiated claims. More scholarly treatment came in Dr. Harriet Lawson's 1983 study, Violence and Community on the Texas Frontier, which placed the Carter case within the broader context of isolation, limited law enforcement, and the tenuous nature of social bonds in recently settled territories. Lawson argued that the Carter operation, while extreme in its methodology, represents an extension of the frontier's underlying economic logic, the extraction of value through any available means, constrained only by practical limitations rather than moral boundaries. The Carter case resurfaces periodically in popular culture, often in distorted form. A 1985 horror film, loosely based on the events, portrayed the Carters as supernatural entities rather than human criminals. A 1990s television series on historical crimes dedicated an episode to the case, though it emphasized the manhunt rather than the crimes themselves. More recently, several podcast series have explored the case with varying degrees of accuracy and sensationalism. What makes the Carter Ranch story enduringly disturbing is not merely the horror of what occurred there, but the questions it raises about human nature and community oversight. How did Thomas and Eleanor Carter, individuals of education and apparent refinement, transform into methodical killers? How did a community fail to notice the pattern of disappearances connected to a single location? And perhaps most unsettling, how many similar predators operated undetected in the vast, sparsely populated territories of 19th century America? Sheriff William Holcomb, who led the investigation after Finley's discovery, offered perhaps the most sobering assessment in a private letter to his brother in 1895. What troubles me still about the Carter affair is not just the depravity we uncovered, but how long it continued without detection. I've come to believe that for every such case we discover, 3 or 4 others continue undisturbed. The vastness of this country allows for pockets of darkness where the normal constraints of civilization simply do not penetrate. And in such darkness, monstrous things can flourish while wearing the aspect of ordinary life. The final word on the Carter Ranch case might best belong to Martha Jenkins, the store clerk who had known the Carters personally and was interviewed in her old age in 1968. After recounting her memories of Eleanor Carter selecting spices for her special preserves, Jenkins fell silent for several minutes. When she spoke again, her words were carefully chosen. "I've had 3/4 of a century to think on what happened at that ranch. I've seen world wars come and go, watched horses give way to automobiles, seen Abilene grow from a dusty cattle town to what it is today. And in all that time, nothing has unsettled me more than the memory of Eleanor Carter's smile when she spoke of her secret ingredients. It wasn't cruel or twisted in any way that showed. It was pleasant, ordinary, the smile of a housewife sharing a domestic confidence. Jenkins paused again before concluding, "That's what haunts me still. Not the horrors they committed, but how completely normal they appeared while committing them. It makes you wonder how many monsters walk among us, wearing human faces so convincing we never think to question what might lie beneath. Some nights, I still wake up wondering how many other Eleanor Carters I've encountered in my long life without ever suspecting what they truly were. The land where the Carter Ranch once stood is now private property, used for oil extraction since the 1950s. Nothing remains of the original structures. No marker commemorates the events that transpired there. The story lives on only in fragmented records, disputed accounts, and the persistent discomfort it creates. The suggestion that sometimes those who disappear don't just vanish. Sometimes, in the most literal and disturbing sense, they are consumed by the very communities that fail to notice their absence. As you drive west from Abilene today, the landscape still holds the same vast emptiness it presented to travelers in 1890. The horizon stretches endlessly, punctuated by oil derricks instead of windmills, but no less isolating for all our modern connectivity. Somewhere out there, unmarked and unremarkable, is the ground where the Carter Ranch once stood. The wind passes over it just as it passes over any other patch of Texas soil, carrying no memory of what that ground once absorbed. And sometimes, in certain small-town restaurants along the old routes, when the special is described as an old family recipe, one might pause to wonder just how old and whose family, and what recipes were passed down through generations best forgotten. For some secrets, like the final fate of Thomas and Eleanor Carter, the Texas landscape keeps its counsel, vast and silent under an endless sky.